The trail camera at the edge of the deer carcass had been rolling for 4 hours. The researchers who set it were expecting a bobcat. They'd been tracking the deer for months through a GPS collar. When the mortality signal came in that morning, they followed it to a hillside south of Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota. The carcass had been dragged under a pile of leaves and covered, cached the way a big cat caches a kill, not scavenged the way a coyote leaves one. They set 2 cameras on the site and walked out. The bobcat never came. A kitten stepped into the frame first, then a second, then a third. Then the mother, long-bodied, tawny along the back, her tail thick at the base and tipped in black. The kittens looked 7 to 9 months old, still shadowing her at the kill. The 4 of them fed at the carcass for more than 7 hours. The cameras recorded 435 minutes of high-definition footage: grooming, low growls, a hiss when 2 kittens crowded the same piece of meat, a breeding female, 3 surviving kittens. Filmed by the University of Minnesota's Voyageurs Wolf Project on March 25, 2026. It is the first confirmed evidence of cougar reproduction in the eastern half of the United States in more than 100 years. And Minnesota is now the closest known breeding population to a region where, according to the federal government, cougars have been extinct since 1938. Puma concolor cougar, the Eastern Cougar, was formally declared extinct by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on January 22, 2018, and removed from the federal endangered species list the following month. The ruling cited a last verified specimen from 1938 and concluded that no reproducing population had existed anywhere in eastern North America for at least 70 years. So here is the question the paperwork can't answer. If the Eastern Cougar died in 1938, what is walking past these cameras now? For most of the 20th century, that question had an easy answer: nothing. Bounty programs across the northeastern United States and eastern Canada had paid hunters and trappers for cougar kills since the 1600s, and by the early 1900s, the species had been pushed out of nearly every state east of the Mississippi. The extinction narrative wasn't an assumption. It was the observed outcome of 2 centuries of deliberate eradication. Wildlife agencies stopped budgeting for cougar management in the East because there was, by every available measure, nothing left to manage. What's changed isn't the history. It's the animals turning up in places that history says are empty. New Brunswick is roughly 83% forested, close to 7 million hectares of spruce, fir, hemlock, and mixed hardwood, most of it crownland, thinly roaded, drained by cold rivers few outsiders ever paddle. In the southwest, the terrain rises into hill country near the Maine border. This is a corridor. White-tailed deer move through it in numbers. So do coyotes, lynx, black bears, and moose. For a large solitary predator, the province offers exactly what a large solitary predator requires: cover, prey density, water, and blocks of dark forest large enough to hold a home range no biologist has ever fully walked. Fundy National Park alone protects more than 200 square kilometers of interior wilderness. That forest continues west across the Maine border into more than 3.5 million contiguous acres of the North Maine woods, one of the largest unbroken blocks of commercial forest left in the continental United States. An animal capable of crossing 2,000 kilometers, as you'll see, would not find New Brunswick a barrier. It would find it a route. Consider what that terrain actually offers a large predator trying to stay unseen. Human population density across most of interior New Brunswick runs under 10 people per square kilometer. Logging roads exist, but they're gated, seasonal, and often impassable for half the year. Cell coverage drops out within a few kilometers of most secondary roads. Search and rescue teams routinely spend days locating lost hikers in terrain smaller than a single cougar's home range. If a 140-pound cat wanted to cross the province without a human ever laying eyes on it, the geography would cooperate at every step. Compare that to the animal's known tolerance for proximity to people. Cougars in the western United States routinely maintain home ranges that overlap suburban development. Boulder, Colorado, the outskirts of Los Angeles, the foothill communities above Reno. They are not wilderness specialists in the way wolverines or lynx are. They are ambush predators that prioritize cover and prey density over distance from humans. New Brunswick's forest, fragmented as it is by logging roads and small settlements, still offers far more unbroken cover than most of the cougar habitat currently occupied out west. The forest does not disprove the sightings. The forest is why the sightings persist. Which brings the question back around. If the country can hold the animal, why has the animal never been held? The most credible evidence begins with hair. In 2003, Parks Canada researchers set baited hair snares and camera stations across Fundy National Park. Genetic testing on the recovered samples confirmed cougar DNA from two separate individuals, two different animals moving through the park at different times. The samples were small. They were consumed in the process of testing them. No repeat sample has ever matched the results since. Similar confirmations exist elsewhere along the Eastern Range. On June 11, 2011, a male cougar was struck and killed by an SUV on the Wilbur Cross Parkway in Milford, Connecticut. Genetic analysis published in the Journal of Mammalogy traced the animal's origin to the Black Hills of South Dakota, a straight-line distance of more than 2,450 kilometers. Researchers reconstructed its route using confirmed hair and scat samples. 3 locations in Minnesota, 3 in Wisconsin, 1 in Michigan, 1 in New York. The actual ground covered likely exceeded 2,700 kilometers over roughly 2 years. A single male, moving alone, searching for a mate that was never there. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources has independently verified individual cougars in Baraga, Delta, Schoolcraft, Chippewa, Ontonagon, and Menominee counties, tracked on trail cameras between 2018 and 2021 in what looks like a stepping stone corridor pushing east. Beyond that band of hard genetic evidence, the record gets harder to verify. Hundreds of New Brunswick sighting reports sit archived at the New Brunswick Museum with no tissue sample and no unambiguous photograph attached. But the testimony is strikingly consistent. Loggers, trappers, and rural drivers describe the same outline, decade after decade. A tawny body, a long, heavy tail, none of a bear's barrel chest, none of a bobcat's or lynx's stub tail. The shape hasn't changed in almost a century. In 1938, a cougar was shot in Somerset County, Maine, the last specimen accepted as authentic in the eastern United States. In 1996, lab tests confirmed another in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. In 2011, Connecticut. In 2019, a video out of Digby County, Nova Scotia, was called by biologist Bob Bancroft the best cougar footage I've ever reviewed. In 2023, another sighting near Bouctouche, New Brunswick, same silhouette, same tail, same absence of a body to examine. Not enough to confirm. Not enough to dismiss. That gap between testimony and proof is exactly where skeptics plant their flag, and it's worth taking their case seriously. Wildlife officials who dismiss most sighting reports aren't necessarily being dismissive for its own sake. Misidentification is real and well documented. A fisher or a large bobcat seen at a bad angle in low light can read as long-tailed and tawny to an untrained eye. Escaped or released captive cougars, legal in some jurisdictions as exotic pets until relatively recently, have accounted for a handful of confirmed eastern sightings that had nothing to do with a wild breeding population. Any single report, on its own, is weak evidence, but volume changes the calculation. The New Brunswick Museum's archive isn't 1 or 2 anomalous claims. It's hundreds of reports spanning nearly a century, from a demographic, loggers, trappers, wildlife officers, long-haul drivers, that spends more hours in the woods than almost anyone else in the province, and has every professional incentive to correctly identify what it sees. When that population converges on the same physical description decade after decade, independent of each other, the pattern itself becomes a form of evidence, even without a specimen to back it. The answer isn't theoretical. Cougars are already moving east, and the mechanism behind it has been documented in detail. A 2010 study by Thompson and Jenks radio-collared 24 subadult cougars in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Males dispersed an average of 274.7 kilometers from where they were born. 6 of the tracked males moved more than 250 kilometers. Other studies have pushed the extremes further still. One male recorded at 1,067 kilometers of straight-line movement, one female at 1,341 kilometers. These aren't lost animals. They're subadults, evicted from their mother's territory around 13 to 16 months old, walking until they find ground without a resident male already on it. The Connecticut cougar was simply the outer edge of that same behavior. So was a male tracked in a 2015 study published in Peer J, which followed a cougar moving 749 kilometers in 100 days across the mixed farmland and forest of the Canadian prairies before its collar stopped transmitting. There's a historical proof of concept for exactly this kind of movement, and it isn't a cougar, it's a wolf. Gray wolves were extirpated from most of the northeastern United States by the early 20th century. In 2011, a single male gray wolf walked from the Great Lakes region across the western states and into the northern Sierra Nevada, a distance that wildlife biologists had considered essentially implausible until it happened in front of them. The wolf did what unpaired canids do. It walked. Cougars walk farther, and they walk quieter. A male cougar averages 6 to 8 feet from nose to tail, weighs around 140 pounds, and defends a home range that can run past 150 square kilometers. It hunts almost exclusively at dusk and dawn. It buries partial kills under leaves and returns to feed on them for days. They cross rivers, highways, ski resorts, and suburban golf courses without ever being seen. Two such animals, dispersing independently, decades apart, along the eastern seaboard, could pass through New Brunswick and leave behind exactly what the record actually contains: a partial track in soft ground, a snapped branch, 2 hairs consumed by a lab test, 1 frame of grainy trail cam footage that half the museum staff will call a house cat. It helps to understand just how little a cougar needs to survive undetected. Unlike wolves, cougars don't howl to communicate across territory. They're almost entirely silent outside of mating calls and kitten vocalizations, and a lone disperser has no reason to make either sound. They don't travel in packs that leave a wide, repeated trail. They don't scent mark as conspicuously as canids do. A single cougar moving through unfamiliar territory behaves less like a resident predator establishing a range and more like a ghost passing through, feeding opportunistically, bedding down in dense cover during daylight, and covering ground at night when visibility for both humans and prey drops to near zero. That combination, solitary movement, nocturnal travel, minimal vocalization, and a hunting strategy built entirely around not being detected, is precisely what makes a transient cougar almost the ideal animal for slipping across a continent unnoticed. The same traits that make cougars devastatingly effective ambush hunters also make them next to invisible as long-distance travelers. If cougars are physically capable of reaching New Brunswick, and the tracking data says clearly that they are, why has no unambiguous carcass, no complete DNA panel, no verified breeding pair ever been documented east of the Great Lakes? There are 3 answers, and none of them require the animal to be imaginary. The first is in the dispersal data itself. Female cougars, unlike males, rarely leave home. Long-term work in New Mexico by Sweener and colleagues found that roughly half of subadult females never disperse at all. They stay philopatric, settling near where they were born. In the Thompson and Jenks study, females averaged only 48 kilometers of dispersal against 274.7 kilometers for males. A 2016 analysis by LaRue and Nielsen's 16 analysis by LaRue and Nielsen found it took nearly 20 years of continuous dispersal for cougars to establish a breeding population in the Pine Ridge region of Nebraska, a distance of less than 160 kilometers from the source population in the Black Hills. To reach New Brunswick, a female cougar would need to walk farther than any female cougar has ever been recorded walking, which means the animals turning up in eastern Canada, if they are cougars, are almost certainly solitary dispersing males. Single points on a map, not a population. One transient male does not leave behind proof at the rate a breeding pair does. The second is the forest itself. Fundy's core wilderness, more than 200 square kilometers of it, is monitored by a handful of researchers and a scatter of trail cameras. The North Maine woods across the border is one of the largest privately managed forests on the continent. A dispersing male can move 100 kilometers through that terrain in a week and cross paths with no one. The third is preservation. The 2003 Fundy hair samples that confirmed cougar DNA were destroyed by the same test that verified them. That's not an oversight. It's a basic constraint of the technology. Older genetic testing methods required consuming the entire viable sample to amplify enough DNA for a reliable read, which meant a positive result and a repeatable sample were mutually exclusive. Newer techniques have improved on this, but they still depend on having usable material in the first place, and outdoor biological traces degrade fast. A strand of hair caught on bark bleaches and breaks down under UV exposure within weeks. Scat loses viable DNA within days of a hard rain. Saliva on a partially consumed carcass is usually gone before a research team even learns the carcass exists. None of that is unique to cougars. It's the same problem that dogs wildlife forensics generally, from wolverine surveys in the Yukon to snow leopard research in the Himalayas. Elusive, low-density predators are, almost by definition, the hardest animals to build an evidentiary case around, because the very traits that make them elusive, small population size, vast home ranges, minimal scent marking, nocturnal movement, are the same traits that suppress the physical evidence trail behind them. The absence of a repeatable sample isn't the absence of the animal. It's the absence of a lab result that lived long enough to be cross-checked. Rick Bowser still checks his trail camera outside Canterbury, New Brunswick. He's been doing it since 1970, longer than most professional wildlife researchers have been in the field, longer than the province has had a formal protocol for logging cougar sightings at all. He's not chasing a headline. He's watched the same stretch of forest change for more than 50 years and noticed the same absence every time. Tracks that don't match anything else in the woods, deer carcasses cached under leaf litter the way no coyote or bobcat caches them, and twice, an animal at the tree line that was gone before his camera's shutter finished cycling. The New Brunswick Museum has archived hundreds of reports like his and been unable to confirm almost all of them. Not because the reports are incoherent, but because confirmation requires a standard of physical proof that a solitary, silent, mostly nocturnal animal is exceptionally good at avoiding. A paw print near the Trans-Canada Highway weathers out of the mud before anyone can cast it. A trail camera catches 3 frames before the animal moves out of range. The evidentiary bar and the animal's own survival strategy are, in effect, working against each other. The federal record still reads, extinct, last verified 1938. The dispersal data still says a male cougar can walk from South Dakota to Milford, Connecticut in 2 years. Both of those statements are true at the same time. Neither one answers the third statement, which is that something is being photographed in the eastern forests that the paperwork insists shouldn't be there. None of this proves a breeding population exists east of the Great Lakes. It proves something narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. That the biological pathway for cougars to reach New Brunswick is not just possible, but already documented in living, collared, tracked animals hundreds of kilometers closer than anyone expected. The Minnesota footage didn't happen in New Brunswick, but 6 years ago, most biologists would have said it couldn't happen in Minnesota either. Extinction, as a designation, describes an absence. It doesn't describe a wall. Every dispersing male cougar that has ever been tracked, through the Black Hills, across the Canadian prairies, into the suburbs of Connecticut, was, at some point in its life, standing exactly at the edge of what wildlife agencies considered the species' known range. And then it kept walking. The Eastern Cougar, on paper, died in the year the Second World War began. The animal in the frame is still walking.